We at the American Weil Society are really, really excited and proud to be hosting this book launch event with Kathryn Lawson for her new book, Ecological Ethics and the Philosophy of Simone Weil, Decreation in the Anthropocene, out with Routledge right now. So please get yourself a copy, get your library a copy. If you're a graduate student and you can't afford a copy, I actually have two somehow. So feel free to reach out to me. I will send you a copy as well for one lucky graduate student. But we're really proud to be hosting this event and announcing the publication of this book. Kate has been a wonderful, wonderful member and participant in the American Weil Society, in Simone Weil scholarship as a whole, through her own philosophical work, through her work for a long time with the website Attention. We are really excited, and I've said this multiple times, but I cannot emphasize enough how excited we are about this book. My name is Scott Ritner. I am the current president of the American Weil Society for a few more months until April, when I will be passing it on. And I will do the introductions today and then turn it over to our panel to lead the conversation. So first, I'd like to introduce Kate Lawson, who we're here to celebrate and to talk about her book. Kate is faculty fellow at the University of King's College in Halifax. She earned her PhD from Queen's University and has lectured at Carleton University and Heritage CEGEP. She published this book that we're here to celebrate, Ecological Ethics and the Philosophy of Simone Weil, Decreation in the Anthropocene, just this year with Routledge, and recently co-edited another book that came out this year, Unprecedented Conversations, The Political Philosophy of Simone Weil and Hannah Arendt with Bloomsbury. She has also published several chapters and peer-reviewed articles on thinkers including Weil, Arendt, Jean-Luc Marion, Edith Stein, Richard Kearney, Plato, Vivekananda, and Hans-Georg Gadamer. In addition to her academic pursuits, Kate has studied theater arts in New York City and practices of yoga and meditation here where I am in Colorado. She is passionate about nature, animals, and the arts, and we are very lucky to have her as a member of our organization. So the panel for today to discuss Kate's book includes, and I'll do this in alphabetical order. First is Benjamin Davis, who is assistant professor in the Department of Global Languages and Cultures at Texas A&M University. And I told Ben that I was just going to make everything else up. So Ben is also a sea captain. He has scaled Everest. But in reality, Ben is the vice president of the American Weil Society and will be taking over as president in April. He published his book on Simone Weil last year, Simone Weil's Political Philosophy, Field Notes from the Margins, another excellent book, which is also now out in paperback. And also a book on Edouard Glissant. So we're very happy to have Ben participating today. As promised in alphabetical order, our next participant in this wonderful program is Jane Doering. And there we go. Jane Doering is professor emerita at the University of Notre Dame. Her PhD is from Northwestern University, and she has a diploma from the Sorbonne in Paris. Jane has published a number of very important and influential books on the work of Simone Weil, including her most recent When Fiction and Philosophy Meet, a conversation with Flannery O'Connor and Simone Weil, co-authored with Ruth Ann Knetchel Johansson in 2019. I often like to say that without Jane, the American Weil Society might just wither and disappear into nothingness. She is one of our most active and wonderfully encouraging members, and we are all really grateful that Jane would join us today. Finally, and as I said alphabetically, we have Mary Whitlisell, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science in the Department of Humanities, Art, and Social Sciences at South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. Mary is an environmental political theorist who draws on contemporary political thought and critical theory. Her research considers the relationship between climate change, progress, consolation, and pessimism to consider how we cope with climate crisis and environmental injustice. She is currently working on a book manuscript that develops a theory of critical eco-pessimism. As well, she has a forthcoming book chapter that distinguishes between theories of environmental and climate justice. And Mary is working on an article critiquing techno-optimism and another theorizing the discernment of pessimism. And thank you so much to Mary for joining us as well. And so without further ado, I'm going to mute myself and turn everything over to the panel, just with one last congratulations to Kate from me, and I'm really excited to hear what everyone has to say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Scott, for that introduction. It's so wonderful to be here and to have so many friends and colleagues and family come to this launch. It means so much to me, so thank you. And I wanted to just start out by giving a brief introduction to what the book is actually about, what's happening. So I set out kind of, this is an adaptation of my dissertation. And during the process of figuring out what I wanted to write my dissertation about, I found Simone Weil and absolutely fell in love with her work. Up until that point, I'd been thinking I would probably write something on the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who I absolutely admired and adored her work. And then I think the process of doing philosophy is very much kind of a process of falling in love with a philosopher, of really learning more and more, seeing the world from their perspective. And I continue to be astounded by Weil's perspective. As I was doing that work, I started looking more and more into environmental thought, ecological ethics, and really seeing this as the existential crisis par excellence of our time, something that we are completely responsible for, and yet did not ourselves create. And how do we respond to this? How do we be and act ethically? How do we be in the world in the face of such a daunting possibility as the human created annihilation of our planet? It's so massive. And I couldn't think of anyone better than Simone Weil to think through these topics. And yet, she really hasn't been brought into this conversation, which was very surprising to me. So that's what I set out to do with this book, is to bring her into this conversation. So I basically split the book up into 3 sections. The first one being, how can we think through her ethics? How can we apply her ethics to the world at large in areas such as environmental ethics, but other areas too. So that's kind of the first section, is creating more of a structure to Weil's ethics that the hope is people can then read and say, oh, I could see how I could apply Weil to this or that, in a way that oftentimes thinkers like Heidegger or Levinas are applied to contemporary issues. I want to see Weil being applied in that way. And then the second part looks at Weil's reading of Plato. It's a very unique reading of Plato, and I think oftentimes a misunderstanding of that people misunderstand they because of this reading of Plato. So I wanted to clarify what that looks like, and kind of Vey's relationship to the material world as she reads Plato. And then the final section of the book is this application of the structure of her ethical thought to contemporary ecological issues and how we can actually live that, act that out, play that out in the world. So that's the book kind of as a whole. And from here, I guess I will pass it along to our discussants to begin some conversation around the book.
Well, I'll start. That's an interesting introduction, Kate, and bravo, chapeau, and all my congratulations. Because I was interested, and you might want to add anything else to this. What gave you, was there a specific moment, a kind of eureka in which you thought, I know you're deeply interested in the ecological questions. Was there an initial something that pushed you in that direction? But you've somewhat answered it. You might have something else to say. But I'm also interested in logistics. Now, your title is quite a handle. And I wondered, because we all struggle a little bit with editors and titles and book designs. So with the idea of perhaps the moment of eureka in which you decided to do this, and then your very important decisions of the title and the book design, I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Yes, so I think there is something inherently about writing a dissertation, doing this kind of academic work that we hole ourselves off from the world. It's this very solitary thing, or it can be, especially for me doing this during COVID-19, in which it really was just me alone thinking about these things. And yet the ecological crisis kept interrupting that thought. There is no escaping it. There is no being alone in a sense. It's always coming in. It's always presenting itself in these various ways that disrupt our day-to-day existence. And so I did feel a certain responsibility in bringing it in. I liked the idea of decreation for the Anthropocene, in that we do need to completely radically change the way that we've been looking at the world. We need to forego this process of decreation, of decentering the egocentric I, this solipsistic person alone who can look out and totalize and understand everything, and instead reassert ourselves as a part of a community, as a part of an ecosystem, as connected to everything around us. However, the publishers did find Decreation for the Anthropocene to be perhaps a little bit esoteric to Bay scholars. I think most Bay scholars, yeah, awesome. And most other people are, what do those words mean, sir? So this was a way to say, here's what we're broadly looking at: ecological ethics, Simone Weil's philosophy.
I lost my battle with the publisher too around the title, subtitle, so it happens. But you know, one of the joys of reading Kate's book is that it includes illustrations, which is especially significant, I think, to our audience, because you know, reading Simone Weil's notebooks is a kind of unforgettable experience, in part because of the drawings and the letters in Greek and the ink, if you have seen that, and so I wonder if you could talk more about your decision to include drawings as a method, including your own, and then art at the end, and also if you had to sort of fight for that with the press and how that went.
Yes, thank you. I'm actually going to, let's see. Let me see if I can share my screen here. It's okay. Thank you for asking. I do have some some pictures that I wanted to share around that. So my concept of the book would have included a lot more art. It would have included a lot more references to visuals, because I think ultimately what Weil is doing, particularly when we think of her concept of affliction, it's this movement into a meaninglessness, something which we can't have words to describe, that waking up in the night in absolute terror, that there is nothing that you can say. And I think that art is incredible to help us think through and act through these possibilities. So I do have, this would have been the cover had I had, say, my way of things. I would have loved this artwork by Frida Kahlo to be the cover, because I think it does speak to this concept of roots, of becoming in community with the natural world in such a strong way that's both Wailean and speaks to the type of Wailean-inspired ecological ethics that we could create. I did also want to, yeah, isn't that great? I wanted to note a couple of the artists. I know Mary is here today, Mary Mattingly's work, which is absolutely incredible. And I would also recommend going to Mary's website. She has Ebb of Spring Tide. There is a book, What Happens After, which is published by Anchorage Museum. These visuals that she creates, the sculptures, I have not get to see any of them in person. I hope to one day. And then I also have, so the second version here is the print that I did. And these were very inspired by environmental art, particularly the 1960s, these types of, lino prints, these woodblock prints that became so popular at the time, as a way to kind of draw together Weil's thought with ecological ethics. I also wanted to share these two because these were images that I worked on that I think speak to Weil's agonism and how difficult it is to artistically express some of these things. So what does it mean to decreate in the Anthropocene, to create out of destruction? And I wanted to share these simply because of the fact that I don't think either of them work. I think that one is perhaps too light and too whimsical, and the other one maybe a little too grim. So trying to find that balance is something that I see, for example, Mary's work as well as Megan Wood's work. This is one of her, she is predominantly a dancer and works on, this is called Slow Down Sun. And these types of works, these types of artistic presentations, I think are exactly when we're trying to think through what is it that we can do, what's next, how do we think through the Anthropocene from this Wailean perspective. I think these give us some really strong visuals. That's another one from Megan Woods. And I love all of this work as well. Fabrice Montiero. So I'll stop there. Again, I wanted to share this one as one that didn't quite work, but I think that's kind of, for me, thinking philosophically is very much about creating art, seeing theater, drawing together all of these different ways to conceptualize.
Thank you so much for that, Kate. And also thank you so much for writing such an incredible book and for inviting me to be an interlocutor for the environment in this conversation. I don't so much have a question about the book's structure or about visuals, but perhaps my question, because it focuses on Metaxu, can be a bridge to talking about sort of some of the more philosophical aspects of your book. So throughout your book, and I assume this is not surprising to any Weil scholar, but to me as a nascent kind of reader of Simone Weil's ideas, you speak kind of regularly about the importance of metaxou, which is a Greek word that refers to kind of the in-between or mediation or bridging. Can you discuss why metaxou is such an important concept in Weil's philosophical project, as well as how this concept is a meaningful interlocutor for developing ecological ethics? And more specifically, how might Weil's concept of metaxou help overcome the binary between nature and culture?
Thank you so much, Mary. This is a really interesting and rich part of Weil's work. I think this speaks a lot to her use of Plato and the concept of, I think perhaps the best way to think through metaxou would be through Plato's concept of the cave and looking out and seeing the shadows on the wall of the cave. So we have kind of these, if this allegory of the cave is meant to be a way to help us think about how to do philosophy, how to think, we have these three distinct moments. The first one being metaxou, this moment, what is it that makes us turn away from the shadow, that makes us say like, oh, not this, there's something else, there's something more. So this can be a person, it can be a thing, it can be a work of art, it can be understanding a scientific equation. There are all these things that can make us go, oh no, this thing that I thought was the truth, there's something else going on here, there's something else at play. We then move, so for Plato, it's the ascent out of the cave. This is the movement of transcendence, this philosophically turning inward, looking towards what is another possibility, what is something higher. And then the descent back into the cave to try to get the other prisoners out of the cave in Plato, or this immanence, this looking back to, for Weil, looking back to the shadows, looking back to the richness of the things and bringing this light, this divine love for Weil into the world. So it's not saying these are mere shadows, it's bringing richness, it's bringing beauty, divine love, more depth into our understanding of the material world. So in this way, it isn't, they think it doesn't make any sense to pull apart and separate. We have this world up there, and then we have this world down here. The only access we have is through this moment of metaxou, of this bridge between the natural and the supernatural, or to draw that light into the world. So what that looks like environmentally, ecologically, again, I think that the way that I try to set that out in the book is through examples, things that for me have been that so far as how to act ethically in the world. So something like the work of Josephine Mandelman and her work as a water warrior, and so many Indigenous communities and their work in that way. There's also, and Mary, I know you've written about this as well, environmental activism and this, what are the ways that people get people excited or thinking about or saying, oh yeah, that is weird. Why do we prize a Van Gogh painting more than we prize or cherish our lakes, our fresh water? Why, how can you snap people into, oh wait, no, it's not quite like this. We need to be rethinking this. We need to be reasserting. And this also happens through art, this happens through activism, this happens through science.
So then, Kate, given today's atmosphere, which I think is pretty much egocentric, and we all hear to our dismay the dismissal of so many issues of concern about the climate. And among our young people, of whom we're very, very fond, many of them have shied away from long-standing traditional religions. We call them the nuns, in the sense of, oh yeah, we're spiritual, but we aren't going to participate in the organized religion. So it's very important what you've done is to show that Wei's message is valuable to our getting along with our neighbor, truly loving our neighbor, and then loving the world. How do you suppose we can, in additional ways, your book is one, insert the message of Wei into today's world, which is, I think, more than ever, although people are frightened by the extreme weather events, more than ever concentrated on the ego, on the self?
That's a great question. It is difficult to conceptualize for a lot of students, a lot of honestly for all of us to think about how is it that we can think in this different way? How is it that we can expand beyond? I think one way within the classroom is simply modeling the openness to the other perspective, to really listening, to trying to find the places of interconnection, and then move from that point of, okay, I see what you're saying, I see why you're saying this, and then moving into the areas that we disagree with. I think so that type of modeling is one way. I think also when we look at science, art, and work as three ways within Bei to act, all three of these are really important, and trying to be open to all three of them. I think we're all inclined towards one particular way, I think, of expressing this. So how is it that we can be open to and listen to and have conversation and dialogue with other ways? So to say, what does it mean to be able to bring concepts of environmental sustainability from a Western academic perspective into conversation with Indigenous groups in that area that have long upheld sustainability with particular waterways or this type of thing, even if these aren't necessarily scalable, they're not necessarily complementary conversations that would fit easily into one another, they can both exist and kind of create this rich tapestry of understanding. I think these types of opening up conversation in new and different ways can be very helpful.
You know, it's nice to see a lot of old and new faces here, and I want to say hi to Eleanor and to Lindsay. Your book mentions and cites a lot of Weil Society people, which is great to see. It kind of is evidence of the community for those who haven't read it. It's very rewarding of years of discussions we've been having. And I also wanted to think sort of on the flip side, you know, if there are certain readings of Weil that you're trying to, you don't have to name names or whatever, but approaches that you are trying to push back against or offer an alternative portrait that you could bring into relief for us.
I really appreciate that question a lot, Ben, because that's a very purposeful pedagogy and trying to, I guess, embody that. How is it that you call people in rather than necessarily call people out? And then I want to be able to open up these conversations and have these conversations with people without saying, I disagree with you. But as hopefully, I don't just want to be a nice Canadian. I think hopefully there is also within that the points that you can see, oh, I don't agree with this or that style of reading Weil. I would say for me, and this has been, I think, a part of Weil scholarship since the beginning, would be kind of the psychological readings of Weil that emphasize issues of anorexia, issues of gender, issues of sexuality, that I think on I would say on a personal level, I feel very disheartened around some of those readings. And then kind of on a larger academic or intellectual level, I just don't find them interesting. They don't engage in the content of Weil's thought. They're reducing her to her body and blaming her for that, which I think is, we live in a society that loves a woman who hates her body and loves to blame her for that. So I think there is something to be said about that type of Weil scholarship that I strongly push back against. And the way I try to push back against that is by simply not engaging with it. Kind of, you say, okay, and then you move on with the work, because ultimately, that conversation has been going on since the beginning of Weil scholarship, and it will probably continue. I would also say one thing I want to push back against is the idea of decreation as only a self-abnegation, that it's something that stops with the erasure of the self. Because I think that this gives a view of Weil that is not reflected in what she's actually doing. So we do this process of self-abnegation in order to reassert the self as interconnected at the site of the other, to see from their perspective, to be in community with the other. It isn't a process of destruction, which I think oftentimes that reading comes up. And then I would say ecologically, I am working to I think ecologically perhaps, and you can see what Mary thinks about this. I don't know, I think I kind of am trying to walk a line where I want to maintain some form of humanism within Weil, with this particularly strong concept of looking always towards marginalized human beings and looking to their perspective. So I do want to maintain a sense of humanism, which for a lot of ecological ethics is very much not welcome. And I want to do that because of everything that we hear from those marginalized communities that are the ones that we say we're not going to privilege the human anymore. Well, it's not us in academia in our relatively privileged positions that are going to be the ones that feel those issues. It's going to be the more marginalized groups. And so in Canada, we could think one kind of perpetual issue would be around the Inuit population in the seal hunt. And this argument that continues on that oftentimes people will privilege the seal over a particular Inuit group. So what does that look like? They would strongly disagree with that notion. So I think ecologically, it is important to maintain some humanism, but then also to step into this possibility, kind of stretching Weil beyond what Weil was doing, to say, how do we have an interconnection with the natural world? How do we have a sense of duty and responsibility to that which is beyond the human as well?
I think that is actually a good jumping off point for my next question, which is about kind of this tension that I see a lot in environmental political theorizing between ecocentrism and anthropocentrism. And kind of historically, deep ecology has been criticized for being inattentive to environmental and social justice, especially because it has been so concerned with human overpopulation, and because it is explicitly ecocentric, which, as you have said, sort of reifies ecology above and over humans. And it has, for this reason, been derided as potentially devolving into eco-authoritarianism or eco-fascism. By contrast, you argue that ecocentrism and anthropocentrism both maintain a hierarchy where you have either human supremacy to the detriment of the ecological world, or ecological supremacy to the detriment of marginalized populations who, owing to environmental racism and environmental classism, are poised to suffer the worst and first. how do you recognize or reconcile the reconstructed humanist turned ecological ethic you theorize, which both foregrounds social and environmental justice, with some of the limitations of deep ecology?
Thank you. This was a really creative process for me, I think, in trying to think through what they was doing with decreation and seeing all of these similarities within deep ecology. So deep ecology is essentially, because I know we have so many Weil scholars here, it's the movement from, we could say, an ego self into an eco self. It's this expansion kind of within this Spinoza's context of striving, of attempting to have an expansion of the I to include empathy with more and more beings. So you become a higher and higher being, the more you're able to empathize with the other beings around you. And that becomes a higher and higher self. So we have a lot of differences, a lot of similarities between these two, this expansion of the self being probably one of the most important. I think the difference, and to me it's all the difference of in the world, is that deep ecology starts with ontology, whereas Weil starts with ethics. The decreative process is this movement from hearing the other, of seeing the other, of seeing this suffering and choosing not to hurt this person who's suffering, not to take your power, and instead to allow the other to have power, to find this balance, this harmony. And so it's a very different process in this sense. So moving from deep ecology, where we have kind of ontology based, and then ethics is derived later on down the road. Here we have beginning in ethics. And I think, to me, that is very, very important, why I think Weil's decreation does offer something pretty radically different at the end of the day than the practice of deep ecology. And we keep the social, political, ethical at the core of what we're doing.
I wonder if your reaction to that excellent question by Mary, I wanted you to talk more about, you quote another Weil scholar and said that sometimes we need to read Weil with, against, and beyond Weil. That struck me as a very open kind of idea, and it could lead to audacity, in which we decide how to interpret. So if you would speak more about that, and I think it kind of fits in with your concern with Mary's issues.
Yes, thank you, Jane. I think that we need to hold every philosopher, every thinker, every politician to account to be able to put their own thought through their own system, to be able to say, okay, if this is Weil's ethics, how does this statement from Weil hold up to these ethics? And this, because the material social constructs in which we live are continually changing, I think that it is important in our particular moment to ask about the environment, to ask about our duty and responsibility to the larger world beyond the human. And this duty and responsibility has to be, this has to be a thoughtful process. This can't be simply asserting what it is that you want, as you say, kind of bending a philosopher to be what you need them to be. I think it has to be, for Weil, looking at, okay, well, what if the opposite were true? How is it that I can think through this idea from another perspective? How is it that I can step out to the most marginalized person or being and ask, how are they? Are they okay? How am I interconnected with them? How can I see the world from their perspective? To move through, for me, that's very much the heart of what they is doing? How do we ask ourselves that and continue it? To my mind, when we stop challenging a philosopher in that way, the philosopher can become dead. It can become just these words on a page instead of actual lived experience, but I think is very much what they want, is to be a philosopher of action.
So because it's 12:45, let's open up to the audience for some additional thoughts. So there's one question we have already from the chat, and feel free, if you're in the audience and you don't want to raise your hand, you could enter the question to Scott or to me or to the group. So the first one is, all I know of Weil is what I have heard from you, that's you, Kate, on a recent podcast. In addition to your book, what books would you recommend as an introduction to her work? I think you're muted still, Kate.
And sorry, who is that? Who is that from, though?
It's from Dave Ferrier.
Oh, yes. Hi, Dave. So great to hear from you. I would recommend picking up Weil's work. Maybe Waiting for God would be a great place to start some of those essays. I would also, I would really recommend Ben's book. That I think that would be very well suited to you, which is Notes from the Margin. Ben?
Yeah, the title is just Simone Weil's Political Philosophy.
Colon. Yes. I definitely would recommend that book. And there's also so many great books. Lisa McCullough's book I found really wonderful. I love Jane's books, both the most recent one, as well as I think your first book on Weil, Jane, both really incredible. There's so much work being done on her right now as well, which is really exciting. I think we're in a moment of people realizing how much depth and richness there is to this philosopher. So I won't go through all of them, but I would say start with reading Weil herself.
Anyone else from the audience?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I haven't read the book, but I did order it, so I'm looking forward to it. I'm wondering if you could say something a little bit more about the metaxu question that you were talking about earlier, and how you see or how you're reading her Plato differently, or what you think she's doing, maybe even with the cave that's different.
Yes, absolutely. So I think thank you for your question, Inez. I kind of took the hint from Emmanuel Gabellieri, where he says that we have Simone Weil gives us perhaps the most convincing counter argument to overthrowing Plato. That perhaps we don't need to overthrow Plato. Perhaps there's something there that we can actually work with, and we can find this through our reading of Simone Weil and Simone Weil's interpretation of Plato. So what does it mean to see, particularly in environmental ethics, Plato kind of ends up being public enemy number one of the original philosopher who divides the matter from the ideal and sets off this process of the solipsistic human being over and against nature, above nature, always trying to escape the gross material world. We can also look at ecofeminism and these concepts of women being tied to nature, that which is lesser, and men being closer to divine thinking, kind of over and above matter. And so that very much all comes back to Plato. Of course, Weil similarly gets these critiques of herself and her work as being anti-material. And I think what comes down to within Wei's work, it's simply not spending enough time with her work. It's not really diving in and seeing what it is that she's trying to do with this. I think Plato is perhaps a little bit more complicated because, as ecofeminism shows us, Plato very much has been taken up by other thinkers in that way and interpreted in that way across the history of philosophy. He has been this thinker to denigrate matter. So what I chose to do with this book is to say, well, following Kathryn Keller, what does it mean to think otherwise? What does it mean to say, okay, this is how it has been interpreted. How can we interpret it in a new way? And Weil gives us this way in which we can see the good within the material realm, in which we can experience. In fact, that's the only way that we can see it. And this is her offering of Plato that I think is very rich and to me is very convincing. It certainly makes much more sense than the traditional interpretation of Plato that has dominated most of Western philosophy.
I wonder if that leads into another query I had in my mind when I read your sentence that she's much more of a Platonist than a Christian mystic. I wonder if you would elaborate a little bit on that, since you didn't bring Christianity into that last answer.
Yes, absolutely. For Weil, the ultimate, what she's ultimately looking for is truth. And so she thinks that in truth we will eventually find God. She is quite clear about that. But that that shouldn't necessarily be the goal, because that's how you fall into dogmatism and ideology and collectivity and the great beast. This is how you really lose out on the depth and the richness of what's possible. So I think what I like about Weil is she doesn't ask us to believe something until we experience it. That there is this, like, oh, okay, like that. It's not until she has a religious experience that she says, oh, okay, there's something going on there in this level of being. How do I bring that into what I understand about politics and society? And I think that this strikes me as one of the healthiest ways to pursue religious possibility, in that it doesn't attempt to totalize our experience. It allows for an openness to the mystery, kind of this possibility of the dark night that needs to happen. We need to allow ourselves to be atheists if we are really going to move into a place where we could have a divine experience, because anything we've totalized, any understanding that we're going to place on this idea that we could say God, we could say the good, we could say the mystery, that which is beyond, any idea we have of it is never going to be what that thing is, because we have that idea of it. So it's an ability to just look for truth, which I think is a lot more palatable to a larger number of people.
There's another question from the audience. This one is from Sonia McFadden, who says, Flora and I really enjoyed this discussion. To follow up on Dave's question, any further suggestions for introducing kids to philosophy?
Oh, Sonia, what a lovely question. Well, I think inviting their Aunt Kate over for wine would be a great way to start. And I'm not sure, does anyone know any philosophy for kids books? Maybe we'll have to write one, Sonia. All right,
There's
well,
there's a TED talk about why kids make the best philosophers, and I'm blanking on the person who does it is at University of Washington, I want to say, but I'll find the link. And I think like when you have kids, it almost comes naturally, or maybe if you're like trained in philosophy, it comes naturally. Like I feel like you follow their lead, right? They ask a question, you ask a question back. And this is sort of the nature of the TED talk, but the person who's doing it has established a program like philosophy in elementary schools. So I'll find the link and I don't know, send it to Ben or so. I usually teach it in my intro to philosophy course.
Oh, that's a good idea, Inez. That's wonderful. You know, or reflecting on that, the young people, certainly what we would call children at whatever age range you want, always feel much more vulnerable. They, they're very much more aware than once we get to be sort of hardened adults, that, anything could happen at any moment. So, and that, of course, is the crucial aspect of philosophy, always keeping in mind that death is something that you need to reckon with in one way or another. But anyway, just a provocative thought. Thanks, Inez. If you do get that, I'd be interested.
Cynthia?
Thanks. Congratulations again on the book, Kate. I'm enjoying it immensely and looking forward to finishing it, which I have not yet done. I'm also sort of decreated by backlighting in favor of The Life of the Cedar, I think.
Great background, Cynthia.
Yeah, I know, right? My question is about the questions that the project has left you with. So I'm really curious to know, you finished this one. What did it open up for you that you might want to pursue next? Which is another way of asking about where you're going with your research. But even if it's not what you're doing next, I just would love to hear the questions that you're thinking about in terms of Faye and in terms of this project and the kind of energies that it's opened up for your future investigation.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yeah, I think this project, I feel like it was really such a gift to work on, and that I'm not sick of it yet, which is shocking because it was a 5-year dissertation and then another year book, and it still feels very rich. I would love to eventually move it into a class that works to embody some of these principles and these ideals. So what would it mean for students to do projects that actually enact some of these ethics in the world? What would it mean to create art, or bring it into, if they're science students, bring it into, or particularly environmental sciences? What does it mean to bring in these questions to those other areas of thought, into activism, into community gardening? How can we kind of be more like they and actually get our hands dirty in the work, which is, I think, very important. And as a dissertation project, was very much a product in my head. I would love to see it be embodied in the world. And that's been, I think, one of the main lessons that I've gained from Faye, is how important that is, that it can't just be something in your head, which I think, as I'm an introvert and I like to stay in my own head, and it's an important, you kind of always feel, I think that's why I like Faye, is I always feel that push from her from behind of like, okay, now go out and do something about it, which what that's going to look like right now, I'm not sure, but I hope to integrate some of these ideas into a syllabus.
So as we wrap up, to respect people's time as well, but I wanted to, instead of kind of summarizing some remarks, just there was one line that really stuck with me that you were commenting on that has to do with some of these themes we've been talking about, environmental ethics and Faye and Plato, which is, you quote this moment in Plato's Phaedrus where Socrates is talking to Phaedrus and about where he learns. And Socrates says, I'm just going to quote it. This is at 230D for the Stephanus number. I am devoted to learning. landscapes and trees have nothing to teach me. Only the people in the city can do that. So I'm wondering, for me, that line shifts somewhat where we understand like a locus of philosophy, or it's another way that Plato has shaped a certain sense of philosophy, for better or for worse. And of course, no one here, with our bookshelves and everything, are opposed to going to the city to learn. But I wonder if you could say a bit more as a way of concluding about maybe the method that you're working towards, where very clearly you're kind of inching towards something where landscapes and trees do have something to teach you. I wonder what you'd have to say about it.
Yes, so this, I think, Phaedrus is such a rich dialogue in this sense, and one that everyone has to grapple with if you're going to make claims around Plato and environmental thought, because he does very much, true to his word, the dialogues are in the cities for the most part. This is a very rare dialogue in that they are out in the natural world, where he does equate this sense of Dionysian old ways of being, religion, myth. It's very different than kind of the logic conversations of the city. And so there are philosophers, Kathryn Lawson, for example, who will say, oh, he's being ironic when he's saying that because they are out in nature. I don't think that he is. I think that he really does feel this need to go into the city. And again, if we think about the cave, we could say like there is a place to go and experience nature. And for many of us, that is a religious experience, to go out and to be in nature, to have this this connection to everything around us, is absolutely something, we could say St. Francis, we could also say in yogic practices, there's one kind of cultivates one's spiritual fire by being in nature. These are very important moments, but then we need to bring them back. We can't just linger there. We can't be in this pure state. We need to always draw back to one another, to our communities, to the city, to lift one another up and kind of share in that experience. And that's, I think, what Vey does very beautifully.
Well, thank you, Kate. This has been a wonderful conversation. It's always good to see you. And we'll be having more events like this relatively soon. We'll keep everyone posted on the newsletter. You can send me an email if you'd like to join that newsletter. You're not on it, or you could go to the American Weil Society website. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to Kate for the book. Do get it for your libraries. Ask your libraries to get it if you have academic affiliation and you haven't already, to support Kate and kind of Weil studies in general. Otherwise, good to see everyone, and see you next time.
Yes, and I'll just say too, I put my email in the chat there, kathryn.m.lawson@gmail.com. Feel free to, if you have other questions about Vey or anything, I'd love to hear from you. So thank you all so much for coming. It really means a lot to me.